Good morning, friends. In Sunday's sermon, we went to Acts chapter 20, verse 28, to define what the fundamental role of the church elder is. And that role turns out to be a very proactive role in the life of the church, the role of a shepherd. Because the Apostle Paul, carried along by the Holy Spirit, makes it abundantly clear that the elders of the church are tasked by God with the careful oversight of God's people. Just as a literal actual shepherd watches over and pays close attention to each of his sheep, so also should elders watch over and pay close attention to the people that the Lord has entrusted into his care. And we talked about how this role, this job description, these duties can easily lead to a lot of discomfort for the sheep, as it were. Because oftentimes people don't want to have other people, much less those invested with spiritual authority over them. They don't necessarily want them to know what is going on in their lives. And sometimes that's because people know they're living in some fashion that is contrary to how God calls his children to live. And so they don't want the elders or anyone else to know about that because they know they're wrong. Sometimes it's because they're going through some circumstance that maybe they're not actually at fault about anything. They are themselves not involved in any particular sin, but still something is happening that is embarrassing enough that they don't want others to know. Maybe the sin isn't theirs, but it's someone else's in their families and it's having an effect on them, or whatever the case might be. In still other situations, possibly closely related to that one, the situation is maybe not embarrassing enough, but it is painful enough all on its own. And sometimes it feels like it will just be that much more painful if you actually have to go through the process of explaining what is going on and sharing that with other people. So there can be a whole host of reasons why people may not want to share what's happening in their lives, and some of them may, be more legitimate than others. But regardless of the seeming legitimacy of those reasons to not want to share, we still recognize here from Acts 20, verse 28, that regardless of whether or not people want to share their lives, God still appoints elders to be aware of their lives, to be able to help at all times in the lives of their people, but especially if their people are in those kinds of times of crisis. Because in such a time of crisis, taking the right steps to resolve the situation, to find whatever needs to happen for peace, for reconciliation, for comfort to come. Well, generally speaking, those right steps are often the harder steps to take, which is why so many people actually allow bad situations to get worse and worse over time, because at any given moment, the easiest thing to do is to kind of ignore the situation and to not ask for help, to not treat it as if it's really there. And so when the elders do get involved or try to get involved, sometimes it may feel like that will only make matters worse, because at the very least, everything gets so much more real when other people know about it. And you sort of reach a point of no return. You can't go back to the way that it was. You can no longer just pretend it's not happening if you actually do tell the leaders of the church of what's going on. Because again, they're of course going to want to take action to help the situation, to bring it to a healthy and beneficial conclusion for all involved, if at all possible. And again, taking those kinds of steps, most likely they're not going to be easy steps to take. And this is where we really get into the meat of what I wanted to talk about today, because so far this has served as a good recap of what elders are supposed to do, what God has commissioned them to do, to be aware of what's going on in people's lives, not for the purpose of being busybodies, certainly not for the purpose of spreading gossip or anything like that, but so they can actually help. And for that help to actually come, therefore, those elders need to be qualified. If they're going to be involved in this process, investing in the people's lives, again, obviously sometimes in very sensitive situations, then before they're entrusted with that sort of authority, that sort of access to people's lives, they must be proven worthy of trust. And thus we have the various qualifications established by God himself, listed for us in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1. And if a man is qualified, according to those passages, then you can be assured that he, number one, loves the Lord, that number two, that he loves the people in his care, and number three, coming out of that, you can know that if your life is the one he's paying attention to, well, then you can know that he and the elders, plural elders as a whole, that they generally are working for your good, that there are no ulterior motives, that they genuinely care about you and are being faithful to God's purpose to bring your situation to a good resolution, whatever that may be, depending on what the actual situation is. But here's the thing. Those elders, again, can be fully qualified and worthy of trust, and yet that doesn't mean they're going to be perfect. And I think people in general are willing to accept that. Obviously no one is perfect, and yet in practice, no one is going to appreciate it when an elder approaches them in less than a perfect fashion, right? And honestly, that's understandable. I'm not saying that people should be okay with anything less. When you're in a painful situation, when you're stressed to the max, when you're facing one of any number of existential crises, then it'd really be helpful if when the elder comes to help, or the group of elders come to help, that they say the right thing, right? That when they speak, then they're just offering all those pearls of wisdom, that their words act as something that soothes your soul and just brings you to a place of encouragement right away. And please believe me, every elder who is qualified and who does love the Lord and therefore love his people, every elder prays that would be how it works. When we go to someone that we know is hurting, the last thing we want to do is stick our feet in our mouths, to say something stupid or somehow just to say something just bizarrely inappropriate in the moment, which would just make it worse for the person you came to help. And yet there are times, sadly, whether it's a crisis situation or just a random conversation on a Sunday following the worship service, there are times when the elder in question, whoever it may be, is not perfect, and that fact becomes all too obvious. And I don't go into all of this to establish an excuse beforehand, if you know what I mean. I'm not trying to say that it's okay, it's reasonable, it's acceptable for an elder to say something insensitive or inappropriate to the situation, whatever it may be. No, elders should always strive, like anybody else, for the right course of action, particularly with their words, because words come out so easily, which means if they don't know what the right things to say, they probably shouldn't say anything at all, right? Follow that same wise, advice as anybody. But at the same time, when we read that elders ought to be above reproach, according to those scriptural qualifications for being an elder, it is important to remember that does not mean they must be perfect. Okay, and again, I'm trying to walk a line between excusing them for, their sin and just saying, hey, you can't have too high expectations because nobody can meet that standard of perfection. Okay. Rather, being above reproach means that they are indeed characterized by all the positive God-honoring characteristics that follow in those lists of qualifications. Not perfect in all those things, but still characterized by those things. For instance, it is possible for a man to lose his temper on a certain occasion, okay? Once, in a blue moon, those occasions are few and far between, so that when you look at his regular conduct over a larger span of time, you absolutely still would characterize him as a man who is self-controlled and gentle, even if on one of those, few and far between occasions, if you only took that snapshot, he wouldn't look self-controlled. He wouldn't look gentle because of what he said or did in that very specific situation. But again, if you look at his whole life, you'd realize, yeah, he is characterized by these positive things, self-control and gentleness, and etc. And again, this may sound like I'm trying to excuse or hand wave away sin just because it's an elder doing it. So, they get a pass, right? Because they mean well, because they're elders. But that's not my intention at all. Because an elder can say an insensitive word in a situation that requires sensitivity, and that may well be sinful on their part. And therefore, that elder should seek forgiveness from the Lord as well as the people he's insensitive to. He needs to confess his error and strive to not repeat it. But the point I'm trying to make is simply this. Every qualified elder seeking to be faithful to God's purpose is going to do his level best to say the right thing, to do the right thing, to have the correct attitude in every circumstance. But reality dictates that since elders still belong to the category of sinful humanity, there's going to be some occasion where, despite their best efforts, things go sideways, and it's nobody's fault but the elders. And again, my point isn't that people who maybe get hurt in such a situation, they just need to suck it up and give their elder a pass. No, but it is to seek some advanced sense of mercy toward elders, for people to have a willingness to give their elders not a pass, but to give their elders the benefit of the doubt, especially when it comes to their perceived motivations, okay? Because, well, let me just say this. Obviously, if there's an elder that is just constantly sticking his foot in his mouth, who just proves that he can't handle sensitive situations and so on, then, of course, the other elders need to be aware, or they need to be made aware that that's the case, and as swiftly as possible, they need to move to correct it. But in general, while I'm not trying to excuse anything, I am making a petition to the general church population to remember that their elders might be elders, and they might be shepherds, therefore. But they're also human beings who are going on the spiritual journey too. They are hopefully further down the road to Christian maturity than most of the church body. That's why they're elders, okay? But even then, they're still in a process of learning. They're still in a process of growing. And yes, sometimes they're still in a process of learning and growing by making mistakes and stumbling along, and then learning and being trained from that. So there's a very real sense in which I'm saying, love on your elders, and absolutely expect more out of them than what you would the other people in the church. But also remember that they are still human beings who struggle with all the same sorts of shortcomings and weaknesses that everyone else does. And with that, perhaps there can be just that much more sensitivity and compassion and unity in Christ flowing between God's people, shepherd and sheep, elders and people. With that, I pray you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I'll see you soon.